You are welcome once again to Mktg 305, Consumer Behavior. This time our focus is on section 10, and here we'll be looking at reference groups and word of mouth in relation to marketing. As consumers, we need to appreciate the fact that we are social animals. Hence, our actions are likely to be influenced by other actors or entities in the marketing environment. An important way of analyzing the influence of these social entities in relation to marketing is through the use of what we refer to as reference groups. So our focus is on reference groups. Reference groups as a term results from the use of relevant groups as standard of reference against which an individual compares himself or herself. In other words, they are standards of reference for purchase and consumption related decision making. It's as simple as that. Because we operate in a socio-cultural environment, we tend to use others or other entities as reference points in making purchase and consumption related decisions. And these things, this concept has implication for marketing. We'll see as we move along. By way of outline, we'll attempt to give meaning to reference groups and look at the types. We'll look at the marketing implication of reference group, and then we'll also try to see what we mean by word of mouth in relation to marketing. So your reading list. Meaning of reference group. A reference group refers to a group whose presumed perspectives or values are being used by an individual as the basis for his or her current behavior. In other words, we are referring to persons or group of people that, the key word here, that significantly influences our behavior as consumers. As individual consumers, reference groups are people whose attitudes, behaviors, beliefs, opinions, preferences, and values are used by individuals as the basis or guide for judgment or evaluation in relation to a given purchase and consumption situation. There are several types of reference group, from family, friends, church members, classmates, and all that. They are relevant depending on a given situation. Reference group can be seen in terms of large groupings, small groupings, family, formal, you name it. It's important that we need to appreciate the fact that in discussing reference group, we are not necessarily saying that one has to belong to a group to be influenced by it. A group that will serve as a reference point may vary from situation to situation. So for the same individual, the individual may have several reference groups when it comes to different purchase and consumption decisions or situations. In other words, every reference group has its importance in terms of specific decision making, specific consumer decision making. Talking about reference group, it does not only mean we are not only referring to persons. It also includes non-personal entities, such as a website, editorials, such as popular magazines and all that. All these entities can serve as a reference point in certain decision making, and they have relevance to marketing. This circle shows you various reference groups. An individual can be a reference group. Though we use the word group, an individual can also be considered a group in this regard if we use such an individual as a yardstick or a benchmark or reference point for decision making. Family is a basic unit of socialization and therefore an important reference group in terms of our consumption behavior or decisions. Friends, through socialization, we imbibe certain norms and all that. We admire some friends and we see some as knowledgeable when it comes to certain matters and therefore may serve as reference points. Of course, social class has to do with the stratification of members of society based on certain factors relevant to that society, being it education, income, wealth, neighborhood, and so on and so forth. This can also serve as a reference point for our decision making. Selected subcultures can have the youth culture. Culture has to do with the way a group of life behave. So we can look at culture in terms of religion, nationality, age, in terms of occupational groupings, and so on and so forth. All this can serve as a reference point. One's own culture can serve as a reference point, and of course, the culture of others or other countries. What is important about reference point is that it provides standards or norms by which consumers judge their attitude and behavior. And therefore, a decision to patronize a particular brand is largely influenced by our reference groups. For instance, an aspiring politician may choose her clothing carefully so as to gain respect and approval of his or a political party. It's not uncommon to see certain political groupings adopting a particular way of dressing, because that's the reference point, and therefore basis for decision making, even in the area of clothing and dressing. Reference groups influence consumers in two ways. First, it sets attitudes or aspirations, offering cues of what lifestyle and related purchasing patterns individuals should strive to achieve. It sets a standard that the individual in that reference group will strive to achieve. Secondly, reference group as a concept can help define the actual items or goods considered acceptable for displaying those aspirations. One who belongs to a particular group may be expected to wear a particular haircut, or may be expected to walk in a particular way, may be expected to dress in a particular way, to belong. Types of reference groups, there are several of them. Scholars have grouped them, can talk of primary groups, secondary groups, aspirational groups, disassociative groups, formal groups, informal groups, automatic category groups, virtual groups, what have you. A primary reference group is one which members have frequent face-to-face contact and have close relations. Of all the types of reference group that I've introduced you, they may not always be mutually exclusive. One may belong to primary and at the same time may belong to another reference grouping. This normally has enormous influence on consumers because it permits face-to-face interaction and they tend to meet often, and there's some kind of bonding as it promotes cohesiveness and mutual participation. So for instance, families, households, study groups, roommates, and so on tend to be very strong reference points for a lot of decision making. And therefore they exert a lot of influence on our decision making. Of course, the family is seen as the strongest primary group because it's the first group an individual belongs to. secondary reference group, what are we referring to? This consists of people who an individual occasionally sees and have less frequent interaction with. Notwithstanding this situation, members of this grouping tend to have common interests. For instance, professional organizations, churches, church congregation, social club, large social clubs, alumni associations are examples of reference group and may be useful in relation to some specific decision making. However, this type of reference group has lesser influence in shaping the behavior and attitude of individuals compared to primary reference group. We can also talk of aspirational reference group. For this grouping, an individual consumer desires to join or desires to be associated with. The individual may want to be a member of such an elite professional group with strict membership requirements. This reference group tends to be powerful in influencing behavior, since the individual wishes to be identified with that group. So you realize that the individual will model his life so that he or she will be accepted by this group. It's common practice for advertisers to use images of aspirational groups where they give the impression that the use of a particular product or brand has the potential of making the individual get closer to be a member of that aspirational group. I mean, we all dream, we have aspirations and all that. Marketers tend to use that a lot, hoping that the possession or acquisition of a particular product or service can make us get closer to these aspirational groupings. We can also talk of the disassociative group. This is simply a group that the individual may not want to be associated with because its values, norms, attitudes, or preferences may not be consistent with the one the individual consumer believes in. It's common in social marketing where marketers try to give reasons why citizens should not adopt a particular attitude or should not be member of a particular group that they may consider antisocial grouping. So this is simply a group that an individual may not want to be affiliated to. We can also talk of formal groups, which typically have strict rules and structures where principles are laid down and members are expected to follow rigidly. The Chartered Institute of Marketing is one of such formal grouping. But this type of grouping, being a formal group, just remain formal. Mostly they don't get interested in private matters that much. Membership of formal groups usually come with special privileges such as the use of club facilities or career advancement, and this may lead to responsibility in pursuit of the group's aim. There are informal groups too. Such groups normally do not have special membership or attendance requirements other than the common interest expressed. Pressure from this group, the pressure to conform to group norms can be greater in informal groups than in formal groups, though there are no written down rules for members to follow. We can also have automatic groups, which an individual may belong to by virtue of his age, gender, tribe, and so on and so forth. One might think this group do not exert much influence on the behavior of members. But it's important to know that Their members are influenced by group pressures to conform. For instance, when older people are buying clothes, they might not want to buy skimpy clothes that show much flesh because people within their age group do not dress as such. This has a lot of implication for marketing. There are virtual groups. These days, we talk of the internet. People form groups based on common interests and all that, where it may not be face-to-face, but they are free to express their views in relation to given brands and all that. They're able to influence the taste and preferences of each other. They tend to have similar values, norms, and so on, and therefore should be of concern to marketers. Marketers can also influence consumers based on the virtual groupings that they belong to. The use of Facebook is one common platform for these virtual groupings. We can also, in terms of types, we can also talk of brand communities. Here, those who belong to this group tend to share common interests in specific brand. So they deliberate on issues that has to do with the brand in relation to their needs satisfaction. Similar to this, we can also have communities of interest. These are typically hobby sites for people who share interests in sports, professions, and all that. And this influence can also be great and therefore of value to marketing strategy. We can have fantasy groups, which are normally based on groups, whether fantasy games or ordinary games such as chess and all that. There are groups like that. We can also have relationship communities, which are normally based on shared problems and experiences. You go to a particular site where people are sharing their experiences based on what they know or what they've experienced in the past. And that can serve as an important source for decision making for already existing consumers or new consumers, and therefore has ramification for marketing strategy. What are the effects of reference group on individuals? One, reference groups modify behavior of members through socialization. Two, groups enable people develop self-concept through their interaction with their members, through their interaction with other members of the group. By virtue of belonging to a particular group, our self-concept can be shaped to conform with that of the group, and therefore we should be interested in this as marketers. Similar to this, we are saying that another effect is that reference groups affect people through conformity, whether formal or informal. Once they are expected to exhibit certain behaviors or characteristics or attitudes, they are forced to conform and therefore would impact on their decision with regards to the marketplace. Groups also serve as basis for social comparison. Of course, we expect that individuals will evaluate themselves by comparing their performance with others. So these are some of the effects. Effects of reference groups on consumer choice. We are saying that there are different types of influence that reference groups have on the choices consumers make in terms of purchasing. And we can look at this in terms of types of influence, which include normative compliance, value expressive influence, and information influence. Normative in the sense that there are certain norms that they are expected to comply with. It also affords them an opportunity to express certain values they believe in. And of course, it's also a source for knowledge acquisition or information acquisition for decision making, and therefore, again, useful to marketers in terms of eliciting favorable responses from the target market. Normative in the sense that a lot of pressure may be exercised on the individual members. And we are saying that this type of influence is useful or works best when social acceptance is a strong motive, and the product or service involved is visible in its use. In other words, when it comes to products that are conspicuously consumed or publicly consumed, normative compliance is important. Because one belongs to a particular professional groupings, one's purchases may be influenced because there are certain norms that one is expected to comply with. Value expressive influence. We are saying that this has to do or result from the need for psychological association with the group. And it emanates from the need for self-esteem rather than for the need for belonging. They want to be able to express the values they believe in. And then information or informational influence. Because they will need product information as goal-oriented consumers to make informed decisions. So reference group may be useful in terms of normative compliance, value expressive influence, and informational influence. Now let's look at some marketing implications apart from those we've discussed. We are saying that one, marketers must understand an individual's reference group in order to better market products. That's more of a generic statement, because reference group, because of the influence of reference group. In other words, their norms, their attitudes, and so on and so forth is useful in terms of the deployment of the elements of the marketing mix. How to even communicate with this target market, what different things mean to them, and so on and so forth. Reference groups can also influence many aspects of purchasing as information sources, setters of rules, normative influences, and influencers of self-value. Conformity pressure within a reference group can cause some individuals to reject certain products. In terms of, we discussed the associative reference group and all that. The group one belongs to will influence what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So a good understanding of the value systems of the reference group is important to the market in terms of what will succeed and what will not succeed, and the reasons why these things will succeed, or these products will succeed. In this regard, we are saying that identifying and using reference groups in marketing are important because reference groups influence attitudes, goals, aspirations, opinion, and information that determine customer standards and expectations regarding businesses, products, and services. So reference group is actually important. It influences us in a very strong way. Reference group, knowledge of reference group also has the ability to provide useful information about the kind of information prospects, about the kind of information prospects or customers will want or need in decision-making process. It will enable us in more specific terms to know how to shape or package our marketing communication program. Because consumers see the world from the point of their reference group. Of course, knowing about our reference group may also be useful in terms of the kind of persons or personalities that will serve as effective brand ambassadors and so on and so forth. In a nutshell, we can say that reference group can help marketers develop powerful marketing programs that deliver the right messages in the right packaging at the right time in the right place. Again, for instance, before launching a campaign based on reference groups, it's useful to test with a sample of the target market, not just in the case of reference group. Test marketing is important. So it's important that before making use of, rely on knowledge of reference group, one may want to do test market to find out how the campaign is likely to be received. Testing or test marketing will also ensure a match with the values, tastes, opinions, and behavior of the group. There should be some kind of synergy or commonality in terms of this. In other words, it should be possible for the target market to identify with the reference point that the marketer is using, either through the use of brand ambassador or a celebrity. Because the use of inappropriate point of reference in a marketing program is likely to negatively affect a firm's reputation and therefore the success of its brand or company. Yeah, you may want to read about word of mouth, which is a very strong means of communication that can influence consumer attitude and purchase intention. You may want to read on. It's a very useful part of consumer behavior. And of course, you also want to look at the internet and word of mouth. These are your references. Thank you. We've come to the end of another session.